She signed the lease with a pen that had Franklin County Court of Common Pleas printed on the barrel, and the landlord never once looked at it closely enough to ask why. That's the story you're about to hear. A landlord who thought he could pick and choose who deserved to live in his building. A tenant who never raised her voice, never showed her hand, and let him walk himself right into the truth. By the end, he'll stand in a courtroom and hear four words that change everything. All rise for Judge Carter. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because after this one, I've got 2 more stories lined up that you are not going to want to miss. Now, let's go back to the day Michelle Carter walked into the Aldridge Court Apartments for the first time. Columbus, Ohio. Late September. The kind of afternoon where the light through the old warehouse windows turns everything the color of weak tea. The Aldridge Court Apartments sat on a corner in the short north, a 100-year-old building that used to store dry goods and now stored young professionals with exposed brick fetishes and $600 bar tabs. Steel beams. Freight elevator converted to glass and brass. A leasing office behind a wall of frosted windows, the kind that let you see shapes moving before you saw faces. Michelle Carter stood in the lobby with a single rolling suitcase and a folder of paperwork, looking up at the ceiling like she was pricing it. She was 44. Average height, unremarkable in the way that people who don't want to be remembered often are. She wore a gray cardigan over a plain blouse, flat shoes, small gold earrings. Nothing about her said important. That was in part the point. She'd found the apartment because it was 11 minutes from a memory care facility where her mother lived now, and because after 18 years on the bench, the last 6 of them hearing housing appeals for half a state, she wanted for once to just be a person renting an apartment. Not Judge Carter. Not the woman whose name landlord's attorneys said with a specific kind of caution. Just Michelle. She hadn't told anyone at the leasing office what she did for a living. It wasn't a secret so much as an absence. Nobody had asked, and she hadn't offered. Gary Wexler came out of the frosted glass office, already talking. "You must be the 10 a.m., he said, extending a hand with the overwarm grip of a man who'd read a book about handshakes once. 58, silver hair combed hard to one side, golf tan in September. He wore a quarter zip with Wexler Property Management stitched over the heart like a badge. "Michelle Carter," she said. "Nice to meet you. Gary Wexler. I own this place, well, this and 5 others, but this one's my baby." He said it like a joke he'd used 100 times. "You're gonna love it here. We get a real nice crowd. Young professionals, mostly. Doctors, a couple lawyers over in 4B. Real quiet building." "That sounds good," Michelle said. "Quiet is what I'm after." Something moved behind his eyes then, quick, almost nothing, gone before it fully arrived. He glanced at her suitcase, at her shoes, at the folder under her arm. "You said on the application you're in state government?" he asked, in the exact tone of a man checking a box that hadn't been fully answered. "Administrative work," Michelle said, which was true. She just didn't say for whom or over whom. "Huh." Gary nodded slowly, like the word carried more weight than it should have. "Well, let's get you the tour." He walked her through the building talking the entire time, square footage, the gym that had just been redone, the rooftop deck that was basically a private amenity. People don't even know we have it. He talked about the building the way some men talk about a car. They're afraid you'll dent. Denise Holloway trailed a half step behind them with a clipboard, 36 years old, tired around the eyes in the specific way of someone who'd been doing a job too long for what it paid. She caught Michelle's eye once in the hallway mirror and gave her a small, apologetic smile, the kind of smile that meant "I see you, and I'm sorry in advance, and I can't tell you why yet." They reached Unit 2C. Gary unlocked it with a flourish. "Now this one," he said, "this one doesn't usually go to just anybody. We like to be careful who we put on this floor. Good tenants up here. You understand." Michelle stepped past him into the apartment. Exposed brick, tall windows, hardwood that had been refinished at least twice. She set her folder down on the kitchen counter and looked around slowly, the way she looked at everything, like she was reading it for something specific. "It's lovely," she said. "I'll take it." Gary's smile flickered, just slightly, like he hadn't expected her to accept that fast. "Well, great. Great." We'll just need the usual. Credit check, references, first and last month, security, deposit. He rattled it off fast, almost daring her to flinch at the number. She didn't flinch. She wrote the check on the spot, in the same neat, unhurried hand she used on the bench to sign orders that ended other people's cases. Gary watched her write it, watched her sign her name, M. Carter, watched the pen glide without pressure, without nerves. You know, he said, folding his arms, leaning into the doorframe the way he did when he wanted to seem relaxed, and instead seemed like he was blocking it. We've had some issues in the past. Not with you, obviously. I don't mean anything by it. Just, we like to keep the building a certain way. Character, you know? Keeps everybody's property values up. Denise, behind him, went very still. Michelle looked up from the paperwork, calm, unbothered. Her voice even. I understand completely, Mr. Wexler, she said. I'm very familiar with how buildings like this get their character. He laughed, not quite sure what she meant, already moving on. Great. Welcome to Aldridge Court, Ms. Carter. He shook her hand again, harder this time, like he was sealing something. Then he turned and walked out, already talking to Denise about the next showing, already forgetting the quiet woman in 2C who signed her checks like a judge and smiled like she had all the time in the world. He had no idea what he'd just let into his building. 3 weeks later, the first noise complaint would land on Denise's desk, and it wouldn't be about the tenant upstairs who actually threw parties every Friday night. It would be about Michelle. The party in 3D started at 9 and didn't slow down until well past 1 in the morning. Bass came through the floor like a second heartbeat. Somebody dropped a bottle in the hallway and laughed about it loud enough that Michelle heard the laugh through her own front door, 2 floors down and 1 unit over. She lay awake reading a case file on her phone, old habits, and let it go, because that's what you did in a building full of 20-somethings on a Friday. She didn't call the office. She didn't leave a note. She just made a mental record of it, the way she made mental records of everything, and went to sleep a little later than she wanted to. Monday morning, Denise Holloway sat at her desk in the leasing office and opened a new complaint form. Complainant, Unit 2C, Michelle Carter subject. Excessive noise, disruptive behavior, date time. Saturday, 11 p.m., 1:30 a.m. Denise stared at the screen for a long moment before she typed it, because none of it was true. Nobody in 2C had complained about anything. Denise had been the one to field the actual complaint that weekend from a tenant in 3F about the party in 3D, and had logged it under the correct unit. Same as always. Gary had come by her desk Sunday afternoon, coffee in hand, and asked her, casually, almost as an afterthought, "Hey, that noise thing this weekend. What unit was that again?" 3D, Denise said. "The party. I already sent them the standard warning." Right. He'd nodded, looking somewhere over her shoulder. "Do me a favor. When you file that, put it under 2C instead." Denise had looked up at him. 2C didn't complain. 2C is nobody in 2C even called. "I know that," Gary said, like she was being slow on purpose. "I'm not saying rewrite history. I'm saying going forward, if there's noise on that floor, I want it logged against 2C's file. Just to keep an eye on things." "Keep an eye on things," Denise repeated. "She's new. We don't know her yet. I like to build a file early, that's all. Standard practice." He'd smiled at her then, the same overwarm smile he gave everyone, and walked off before she could say anything else. So now Denise sat with the cursor blinking over a complaint that didn't exist, about a tenant who hadn't done anything, because her boss wanted a paper trail pointed at the one unit where it didn't belong. She thought about her daughter's daycare bill. She thought about how new this job still was, for months, and how easy it would be to lose it over a disagreement about a form. She hit save. 2 days later, Michelle found the notice taped to her door when she got home from the courthouse. A single sheet of paper, Wexler Property Management letterhead. A subject line that made her stop cold in the hallway. Notice of lease violation. Unit 2C. She read it twice, standing there in her work clothes, keys still in her hand. This letter serves as formal notification that the management of Aldridge Court Apartments has received a noise complaint regarding excessive disruption originating from your unit on Saturday. Date, between the hours of 11 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. This is your first written warning. A second violation within 90 days may result in lease termination proceedings. Michelle stood in the hallway for a long moment, very still, the way she got still in her courtroom right before she asked a question that mattered. She hadn't been home Saturday night past 10. She'd gone to visit her mother, stayed until the facility's evening cut off, and come back to an empty apartment before 10:30. She had heard the party, from the outside, through the wall, faint and distant, the unmistakable sound of somebody else's unit having a good time 3 floors up. She let herself in, set down her bag, and read the notice a third time. Then she did what she always did when something didn't add up. She wrote it down. Date, time, what she remembered, what the notice claimed. Small, neat handwriting in the notebook she carried everywhere. The same notebook she used to jot down inconsistencies in testimony, contradictions in a landlord's timeline, small cracks that later became the whole case. She didn't call the office that night. She wanted to see what happened next before she decided how loud to be about it. She didn't have to wait long. The following week, she passed Gary in the lobby, and he stopped her with the same overwarm energy as move-in day, except now there was something underneath it, something testing. Ms. Carter, everything going okay up there? Everything's fine, Mr. Wexler. Good, good. You get that letter we sent? About the noise thing. I did, Michelle said. I wasn't home that night. I was visiting my mother. I got back around 10:30, and the unit was quiet when I arrived. Gary's smile held, but something behind it tightened, like a rope pulling taut. Well, the complaint came in against your unit. I don't write these things up for fun, Ms. Carter. Somebody heard something. I understand a complaint came in, Michelle said evenly. I'm telling you the timeline doesn't match what actually happened in my apartment that night. I'd like to understand where the complaint originated. It's internal, Gary said, and for the first time, something flickered across his face that looked almost like irritation at being asked to explain himself. We don't share complainant information. Building policy. Of course, Michelle said. I just ask that whatever record exists reflects that I've disputed it. In writing, if that's all right. Gary's jaw shifted just slightly. Sure, we can note that. He said it the way men say things they have no intention of doing. He walked away first that time. Michelle stood in the lobby a moment longer, watching him go, and wrote one more line in her notebook before she went upstairs. Second data point. Pattern forming. She didn't know yet how far it would go. She only knew, the way she always knew, that a man who lies about a small thing rarely stops at one. It happened on a Thursday in front of witnesses because Gary Wexler had stopped being careful. Michelle came home from the courthouse a little after 6, still in her gray blazer, a stack of case files under her arm. The lobby was busier than usual. A few tenants gathered near the mailboxes, a maintenance man fixing a light fixture on a ladder, Denise behind the frosted glass with the office door propped open. Gary was waiting near the elevator. Not casually. Waiting. Ms. Carter, glad I caught you. He had a manila envelope in his hand, and he held it out like he was serving papers, because he was. Mr. Wexler, I'm going to need you to review this. He didn't lower his voice. If anything, he raised it slightly, angling his body so the tenants by the mailboxes could hear without straining. Second violation, 90-day window. Per your lease, that means we're moving forward with termination. Michelle didn't take the envelope right away. Second violation, she repeated. I wasn't aware there'd been a second complaint. Filed Tuesday. Same pattern as before. Gary's voice had the practiced smoothness of a man who'd rehearsed this in his head on the drive over. I told you, Ms. Carter, we run a tight building here. I can't have this become an ongoing thing. I was in Cincinnati Tuesday, Michelle said. Deposition. I have the calendar entry, the hotel receipt, and 3 colleagues who can confirm I wasn't in Columbus at all that day. That should have stopped him. It didn't. I don't control what our tenants report, Gary said. I just have to act on it. That's the job. He held the envelope out further, insistent, like she was the one being unreasonable for not simply accepting it. By the mailboxes, a young man in a hoodie had stopped sorting his mail and was watching now, phone half raised like he was deciding whether to record. An older woman near the elevator bank had gone quiet, watching too. Mr. Wexler, Michelle said, And her voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen. If anything, it got softer, more precise, the way it did in her courtroom when a witness was about to say something they'd regret. I'd like to see the complaint. The actual complaint. Not a summary. The original filing, the date and time it was logged, and the unit it references. That's not how this works. Gary's jaw tightened. You don't get to cross-examine my paperwork. I'm not asking to cross-examine anything, Michelle said. I'm asking to see a document that concerns me, which I believe I'm entitled to under the lease you had me sign. You know what I think, Gary said, and here it came. The line that would end up clipped and replayed 1,000 times. The line that would follow him for the rest of his life. I think some people move into a nice building and think the rules are optional for them. I think you'd like this to be a bigger conversation than it needs to be. The hoodie kid's phone came all the way up. Michelle didn't look at the phone. She looked at Gary, steady, unblinking, and let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to. I think, she said finally, that you should be very careful about finishing that sentence. Gary blinked. Something in her tone had landed differently than he expected. Not anger, not fear. Something closer to a door quietly closing. He recovered fast, though, folding his arms, leaning back into the posture he always used when he wanted to look unbothered. All I'm saying, he said, softer now, aware of the audience, is that we have standards. And when those standards aren't met, there are consequences. That's just how property works. He set the envelope down on the mail table, since she hadn't taken it. You've got 5 days to respond in writing, or we proceed with the termination filing. That's not me being difficult. That's the lease. He walked back toward the office without waiting for a reply, the way he always walked away first, except this time Denise was standing in the office doorway, and she had heard every word of it, and her face had gone the color of old paper. Michelle picked up the envelope from a mail table. She didn't open it there. She held it, calm, and turned to the small cluster of tenants who were still watching, pretending they hadn't been. Have a good evening, she said to them, mild as ever, and got in the elevator. Upstairs, alone, she opened the envelope at her kitchen counter. Formal termination notice. 30-day timeline. A fabricated second complaint with a date she could disprove with a hotel receipt sitting in her bag. She sat with it for a long time. Not upset or not visibly. She turned the pages over slowly. The way she turned over exhibits she already knew were fraudulent, but wanted to understand the shape of before she said so out loud. Then she picked up her phone and called someone she trusted before she called anyone official. Marcus, it's Michelle. I need to ask you something off the record before I decide whether this becomes on the record. Marcus Reyes, on the other end, in his office at the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, sat up a little straighter at the tone in her voice, a tone he'd heard maybe 3 times in 10 years of knowing her. What's going on? I think I'm being illegally evicted, Michelle said. And I think the man doing it has no idea who he's doing it to. Downstairs, in the leasing office, Denise Holloway sat at her desk long after Gary had gone home, staring at the fabricated complaint still open on her screen, and for the first time let herself really think about what she typed her name under. She didn't delete it. She didn't fix it. But she took a screenshot, quiet, quick, unnoticed, and saved it to a folder on her personal phone labeled, simply, just in case. Neither of them knew yet how soon in case would arrive. Nor did Gary know that the eviction hearing he was about to request, expecting a rubber stamp and an easy win, had already been assigned by pure administrative rotation, the kind no one could fake or arrange, to a judge who knew this case better than anyone in the building ever could. Her own. The hearing room on the 4th floor of the Franklin County Administrative Building looked exactly like every other hearing room Gary Wexler had ever stood in. Beige walls, a raised bench at the front, a flag in the corner, rows of hard wooden benches that always seemed built for a shorter century. He'd requested the fast-track docket himself. His attorney, a heavy-set man named Phil Draper, who handled most of Wexler Property Management's filings, had told him it was a formality. Judge rubber stamps these things 9 times out of 10 when the paperwork's clean, Phil had said in the elevator on the way up. Just don't editorialize on the stand. Answer what's asked. Gary had barely listened. He'd worn his good suit, the navy one he wore for closings, and he sat at the respondent's table with the loose, confident posture of a man who'd done this before and always won. Michelle Carter sat 2 rows back in the gallery, in the same gray blazer she'd worn the day of the confrontation in the lobby, a plain manila folder in her lap. To anyone glancing over, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to look like today, a tenant, waiting her turn, nervous energy carefully contained. Denise Holloway sat near the back, alone, her phone in her purse with a folder of screenshots she still hadn't decided what to do with. The bailiff called the room to order at 10 sharp. This is case number 24 HD 1187. In the matter of Wexler Property Management versus Tenant of Unit 2C, Aldridge Court Apartments. The clerk read from her binder. All parties please rise. Gary stood, buttoning his jacket. Phil stood beside him. Denise stood in the back row. Michelle stood too, 2 rows back, unremarkable, folder in hand. All rise for Judge Carter, the clerk said. The door behind the bench opened. Gary's head turned toward it out of pure habit, the way anyone turns toward a door that's about to matter, and what he saw did not immediately make sense to him. It took a full 2 seconds, maybe 3, for the picture to resolve. The woman walking in through the judge's chamber's door in a black robe was the same woman who had been standing in his lobby a week ago, holding an eviction notice she refused to take from his hand. Michelle Carter walked to the bench without hurrying, the way she did everything, and took her seat. You may be seated, she said, and her voice, the same even, unbothered voice from the lobby, filled the room in a way it never had in the hallway of Aldridge Court. Gary did not sit. He stood there for a moment with his hand still on the back of his chair, staring, his mouth slightly open, doing the math a second time in case the first answer had been wrong. It wasn't wrong. Mr. Wexler, the clerk said quietly, you may be seated. He sat, slowly, like his knees had made the decision without consulting the rest of him. Phil Draper leaned over and whispered something urgent, and Gary shook his head slightly, like he was trying to physically dislodge what he'd just seen and replace it with anything else. Michelle opened a folder in front of her, not the folder Gary had seen in the lobby, a different one, thicker, the case file itself, and looked out over the room with the same calm she'd had signing her lease 3 weeks ago. Before we begin, she said, I want to address something directly for the record, so there's no ambiguity for either party. She looked at Gary, not unkindly, not cruelly, just directly, the way she looked at every case that came before her. Mr. Wexler, I believe you and I have met. Your Honor, Phil started to stand. Sit down, counsel, I'm not finished. Michelle's voice didn't rise, but the room went instantly, completely still. I am the tenant named as respondent in this filing. I signed a lease at Aldridge Court Apartments under my legal name, Michelle Carter, 3 weeks ago. Mr. Wexler was present for that signing. I did not conceal my identity from him at any point during our tenancy, nor do I conceal it now. I am disclosing it to this court on the record, before we proceed one further sentence. Gary's face had gone the color of the beige wall behind him. Given that disclosure, Michelle continued, I have 2 options in front of me. I can recuse myself from this matter entirely and have it reassigned to a colleague, given my direct personal involvement as the named respondent. Or if both parties are willing to state on the record that they have no objection to my hearing this case despite the conflict, which I would only accept under extremely narrow circumstances, we could proceed today. She looked at Phil Draper. Counsel, your position. Phil, to his credit, understood immediately how this needed to go. Your Honor, given the nature of the disclosure, the respondent would request recusal and reassignment. That request is granted, Michelle said, already writing. This matter is recused to Judge Alvarez, effective immediately. I will have no further involvement in the underlying eviction proceeding. She set down her pen. However, the word landed like a second door closing. I want to be clear about something else, for the record, in front of both counsel, Michelle said. The fact that I am recusing myself from hearing this case does not mean the underlying conduct disappears. I have already, independently of my role on this bench, filed a complaint with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission regarding the eviction notice served to me, the fabricated timeline in that notice, and statements made to me directly by Mr. Wexler in the lobby of that building in front of witnesses. That complaint exists whether I am sitting here or not. It was filed as a private citizen, Michelle Carter of Unit 2C, and it will proceed through the commission on its own timeline, separate entirely from anything in this room. Gary finally spoke, his voice smaller than anyone in the room had ever heard it. Your Honor, I didn't know. When I served that notice, I had no idea you were. Mr. Wexler. Michelle's voice was gentle now, almost the gentleness that was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. That's precisely the problem. You didn't know. You served that notice to a woman you believed was simply a black tenant in a building you felt she didn't belong in. The notice would have been just as illegal, just as fabricated, if I had been exactly who you assumed I was, and nothing more. My title doesn't make what you did wrong. It just means you got caught by someone with the training to prove it. The room was silent enough to hear the ventilation system hum. This matter is reassigned, Michelle said, closing the folder. Judge Alvarez's clerk will contact both parties within 48 hours. Court is adjourned on this docket entry. She stood, and the clerk called the room to rise again. And this time when Gary Wexler stood up, his hands were visibly shaking. Michelle walked out through the same door she'd entered, robes swaying slightly, without once looking back at the table where he sat. Denise Holloway, in the back row, finally took her phone out of her purse. Marcus Reyes had a rule about first meetings with complainants. Let them talk as long as they need to before you say anything about strategy. Michelle Carter didn't need that rule. She sat across from him in a small conference room at the Ohio Civil Rights Commission 2 days after the hearing, in street clothes, no robe, and laid out the entire timeline in the same flat, organized voice she used for everything, like she was presenting someone else's case. Move-in was September 22nd, she said, sliding a folder across the table. First fabricated complaint, October 6th. I have documentation I wasn't home during the window described. Second complaint, October 20th. I was in Cincinnati for a deposition. Hotel receipt, calendar entry, 3 witnesses. Termination notice, served October 22nd, in the lobby, in front of at least 4 other tenants and a maintenance worker. Marcus flipped through the folder as she talked. Notebook pages photocopied. Dates. Times. A short paragraph, in Michelle's own hand, transcribing Gary's exact words in the lobby as closely as she could recall them, written the same evening while they were still fresh. This is... Marcus exhaled. Michelle, this is the cleanest paper trail I've seen a complainant bring in probably 5 years. Most people don't think to write any of this down until it's too late. Habit, Michelle said. I've read 1,000 cases that fell apart because nobody wrote anything down until they were angry enough to remember it wrong. There's something else, Marcus said, turning a page. You said in your statement he made comments about the building's character. On move-in day, and again in the confrontation. That's not just an illegal eviction case anymore. That's a pattern of discrimination case, if we can show it's not isolated to you. I assumed that's where this was headed, Michelle said, which is why I didn't file this alone. She slid a second, thinner folder across the table. Inside were 4 names. Former tenants of Wexler Property Management buildings across Columbus, 2 from Aldrich Court, 2 from a sister building in Clintonville, each with a short, similar story. A black graduate student denied a lease renewal over a noise issue that was never substantiated. A Latina nurse charged a security deposit adjustment that white tenants in identical units weren't charged. A retired postal worker told, almost verbatim, that the building liked to keep a certain character. How did you get these? Marcus asked. I didn't, Michelle said. A tenant advocacy group I used to volunteer with before I was on the bench put out feelers after word got around about my hearing. These 4 came forward independently. Before I ever asked anyone to look. I only organized what already existed. Marcus sat back, and for the first time in the meeting, allowed himself something close to a smile. You know what this means. If even 2 of these 4 hold up under investigation, we're not just filing an illegal retaliation complaint on your behalf. We're opening a pattern or practice investigation into the entire company. That's federal adjacent. That's Fair Housing Act territory, not just state code. I know what it means, Michelle said. I've written the opinions that come out the other side of those investigations. I know exactly what it means for him, and I know exactly what it will take to prove it cleanly enough that no appeal survives it. You could have just let your own case go quietly, Marcus said. Recusal, quiet settlement, move to a different building. Nobody would have blamed you for keeping this small. Michelle considered that for a moment, hands folded on the table. The same stillness she carried on the bench when she was deciding how much of her reasoning to say out loud. I thought about that, she admitted. But I kept thinking about the graduate student in that folder, and the nurse, and how many people like them never end up living next door to someone who happens to know exactly how to build the case that gets them believed. I got lucky in one specific way, Marcus. I have training most people in my position don't have, and a job title that makes people nervous enough to be careful once they know it. That's not justice. That's an accident of who ended up in Unit 2C. I'd rather use the accident than waste it. Marcus closed the folder and looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. I'll open the formal investigation today. Pattern or practice, all 5 properties, going back 3 years of tenant records. I'm also going to need you to formally step back from any commission role until this resolves. You understand that. I already submitted the recusal paperwork this morning, Michelle said. For every open matter touching Wexler Property Management, past and future, indefinitely. Of course you did, Marcus said, almost laughing despite himself. The investigation moved fast once it opened. Faster than these things usually did, in part because Wexler Property Management's own paper trail did most of the damage on its own. Subpoenaed maintenance logs showed noise complaints filed against units, with no corresponding call records. Security deposit spreadsheets, cross-referenced with lease applications, showed a pattern that didn't survive a first-year statistics course, let alone a courtroom. And within a week, investigators had a name inside the company willing to talk. Denise Holloway called Marcus's office on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice tight and fast, like she was trying to get the words out before she could talk herself out of it. I have something, she said. I have a lot of somethings. I should have come forward before now. I'm coming forward now. Denise Holloway sat in a Civil Rights Commission conference room with her phone face up on the table between her and 2 investigators, like it was something that might go off if she moved too fast. Take your time, the older investigator said. Her name was Patricia Nwosu, and she'd done this enough times to know that people who came forward voluntarily usually needed the first 5 minutes just to stop shaking. I have screenshots, Denise said. Going back almost a year. I didn't know what I was going to do with them when I started saving them. I think I didn't want to be the only one who remembered it happened, if that makes sense. It makes sense, Patricia said. Walk us through what we're looking at. Denise opened the folder on her phone, labeled just in case, and slid it across so the investigators could see the screen. Complaint logs, internal emails, a screenshot of a text from Gary that read simply, log noise complaint under 2C, keep an eye on that unit. Sent the same Sunday afternoon he'd stood at her desk in person and told her the same thing out loud. He texted you the instruction too, Marcus asked, leaning forward. He did it both ways sometimes, Denise said. In person when he wanted deniability. In writing when he wanted a record he thought was harmless because it didn't say anything explicit. He never once wrote the word black or race anywhere. But if you line up who got flagged, who got the deposit adjustments, who got the friendly renewal letters versus the 90-day warnings, it's not subtle once you see all of it at once. She scrolled further. A spreadsheet Gary kept himself, one Denise had photographed off his monitor months ago on an instinct she still couldn't fully explain. A column labeled simply notes, with entries like good tenant, quiet, fits next to some names, and keep watching next to others. The pattern in who received which label was not something either investigator needed explained to them. Why now? Patricia asked, not unkindly. You could have brought this forward the day he told you to falsify the first complaint. Denise was quiet for a moment. Because I told myself it was one form. One time. I have a daughter. I have rent. I told myself I'd say something if it ever got worse. She looked up. And then I stood in that hearing room and watched him serve eviction papers to a sitting judge without knowing it. And I realized the only reason any of this was about to come apart was because he happened to pick on someone he couldn't outmaneuver. Everybody else he's done this to over the years didn't have that. They just lost their apartments and moved on, and I helped him do it, and I told myself it wasn't my fault because I wasn't the one saying the words out loud. You're saying it out loud now, Marcus said. I'm saying all of it, Denise said, and pushed the phone another inch closer to them. Everything. Names, dates, every message I saved. I want to be on record as a witness, not just a source. I'll testify. The formal statement took most of the afternoon. By the end of it, the commission had sworn testimony connecting Gary Wexler directly to the fabricated complaint against Michelle, a documented pattern across at least 6 other tenants, and an internal company culture that treated racial screening as a normal, if unspoken, part of keeping the building's character. 2 days later, investigators executed a records request at the Wexler Property Management Office. Gary was there when they arrived, and according to the 2 investigators present, he did not ask what the visit was about. He simply sat down at his desk very slowly, like a man who already knew. Phil Draper met with him that evening in his office, the good suit long gone, Gary in a wrinkled polo, staring at a legal pad with nothing written on it. How bad, Gary said. Not really a question. They have Denise's records. They have your tenant, the judge, with a paper trail that would make a first-year law student blush. They've got 4 other tenants lining up behind her. Phil closed his folder. I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you, Gary. This isn't a fine and move on situation anymore. This is a license, Gary. This is a business. She never said anything, Gary said quietly. That whole time. She let me walk right into it. She didn't do anything to you, Gary, Phil said, with more edge than he usually allowed himself with a client. You did this. She just didn't stop you from finishing. Gary didn't answer. He sat there a long time after Phil left, staring at the blank legal pad, the framed photo on his desk of the ribbon cutting when he'd bought Aldridge Court 12 years ago, young and certain and sure the building would only ever go one direction. Across town, in a much smaller apartment, she'd signed a new lease on 2 weeks earlier. Michelle Carter sat at her kitchen table finishing paperwork of her own. Nothing to do with the case. Just her mother's care facility renewal. The ordinary business of an ordinary life. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Asterisk Denise came in today. Gave us everything. This is over for him, Michelle. It's just a matter of how it ends now, asterisk. She read it twice and set the phone face down and went back to her mother's paperwork because some parts of her life, she decided, were still allowed to just be hers. He was waiting outside the courthouse when she came out 6 weeks later, on the day the commission's findings became public record. Michelle saw him before he saw her, Gary Wexler, standing near the steps in a coat too heavy for the weather, hands in his pockets, looking smaller than he had in either the lobby or the hearing room. He'd lost weight. His hair wasn't combed the same careful way it used to be. She could have walked past him. There was a side exit, and part of her considered it. Instead, she stopped a few feet away on the top step and waited for him to say whatever he'd come to say. Ms. Carter. He caught himself. Judge Carter. I wasn't sure you'd talk to me. I'm listening, Mr. Wexler. He shifted his weight, looked down at the steps, looked back up. I read the findings this morning. All of it. The other tenants, Denise's records. All of it laid out in one document. He exhaled, and it came out shakier than he probably wanted it to. I keep trying to figure out how to explain it to my kids. My daughter asked me if I was racist, and I told her no, and then I sat there afterward and couldn't actually finish the sentence about why not. Michelle didn't say anything. She let the silence hold the way she always did, and he kept talking into it, because that's what silence usually did to people who weren't used to being met with it. I told myself for 20 years I was just protecting the business, he said. That it wasn't about who people were, it was about risk, property values, keeping things stable. I never once thought of myself as the guy in the story. The guy who does the thing everybody agrees is wrong. I thought that guy wore it on his sleeve. I thought I'd know if it was me. Most people who do this don't think it's them, Michelle said quietly. That's not an excuse, Mr. Wexler. It's the actual mechanism. If it required you to think of yourself as a bad person, it wouldn't have lasted 20 years. It only works because it doesn't feel like anything at all from the inside. He nodded slowly, like that landed somewhere he hadn't expected. I'm going to lose the license, he said. Probably the company. Denise's record alone. I don't have anything to argue with. I'm not asking you to fix that. I know that's done. He looked up at her, and for the first time there was something almost pleading in it, though he tried to keep out of his voice. I guess I just wanted to say it to you, directly. That I'm sorry. Not because I got caught. I know how that sounds, I know everybody says that. But I've had 6 weeks to sit with what I actually did, to you specifically, and I am sorry for it. Michelle considered him for a long moment. Not coldly, not with the flat neutrality of the bench, just carefully, the way she considered most things. I believe that you're sorry right now, she said. Sitting on these steps, having read the findings this morning, watching your business end, I believe that's a real feeling you're having. I want to be honest with you about that much. But, Gary said, hearing it coming. But this isn't about one moment, Michelle said. It's about a pattern that ran for years, that you built systems to protect, that you taught Denise to help you maintain, that cost real people their homes long before it ever touched me. An apology on the courthouse steps, after the findings are public, after the paper trail is already sealed. I don't have anywhere to put that, Mr. Wexler. It doesn't undo what happened to the graduate student who lost her renewal. It doesn't give the nurse her deposit back with interest for the years she went without it. I know, he said quietly. I'm not telling you not to be sorry, Michelle said. I think you should sit with this for a long time. I think your daughter's question deserves a real answer, and I don't think you have one yet, and I think that's worth staying uncomfortable about instead of rushing past it. But I'm not going to stand here and tell you it's fine, or that I forgive something on behalf of 6 other tenants who aren't standing on these steps with you. Gary nodded slowly, like he'd known that was the shape the answer would take before he'd asked the question, and had come anyway because some part of him needed to hear it said plainly. For what it's worth, he said, I hope whatever comes next for you is easier than this was. Thank you, Michelle said, and meant it in the small, uncomplicated way you can mean something for a person even while you hold them fully accountable. I hope you use the time you have left in this to actually understand it, not just apologize for it. She walked down the steps past him. He didn't follow and didn't call after her, and stood there a while longer in the cold, watching her go, turning her words over the way you turn over something you suspect you'll be thinking about for a long time. 6 months later, Aldrich Court Apartments had a new sign in the lobby, right next to the mailboxes, laminated and slightly too enthusiastic in its font choice, but unmistakably permanent. Tenant Resource Office. Hours Tuesday and Thursday 4 to 7 p.m., or by appointment. Gary Wexler was gone by then. His business partner, a quieter man named Steve Ambrose, who'd owned 40% of the company and had spent the entire commission investigation looking like a man watching a house he lived in catch fire from the outside, bought out Gary's remaining share in February at a price that was, by any honest accounting, a mercy. The consent decree that settled the commission's findings barred Gary from operating rental property anywhere in Franklin County for 7 years, required $175,000 in civil penalties and mandated restitution, calculated unit by unit, tenant by tenant, to everyone the pattern had touched. His attorney handled most of the paperwork by then. Gary mostly just signed where he was told to sign. Steve kept the company name off the door for a while, unsure what to rebuild it as, and brought in a fair housing compliance firm before he did anything else. Mandatory training for every leasing agent across all 6 properties, a third-party audit of every complaint filed in the last 3 years, and at Denise Holloway's suggestion, the Tenant Resource Office itself, a physical place, staffed by someone other than the leasing agents, where tenants could report concerns without going through the same person who managed their lease. Denise ran it herself, 2 afternoons a week, on top of her regular job. She'd kept her position, placed on a formal performance improvement plan for the first 90 days, which she'd accepted without complaint, understanding exactly why it existed. Steve had wanted to let her go initially, uneasy about keeping anyone who'd been part of the old system, but the commission's own report had been explicit. Denise Holloway was the reason the pattern or practice case closed as fast and as thoroughly as it did. Punishing the whistleblower alongside the violator wasn't justice. It was just a different kind of unfairness. a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch, working on a follow-up piece 6 months after the story first broke, stopped by the building on a Thursday afternoon and found a woman named Alicia Torres sitting in the little Tenant resource office waiting room, a folder of her own paperwork in her lap. Not a complaint, just a lease renewal question, the kind of ordinary business that used to happen at Denise's old leasing desk without anyone thinking twice about it. Has it actually changed? The reporter asked her. Or is it just the sign that changed? Alicia thought about it for a second before answering, the way people do when they want to be accurate rather than just polite. I moved in 8 months ago, right before all of it came out, she said. I'll be honest, I almost broke my lease when the story hit. I didn't want to be in a building with that history. But I stayed, and I watched what actually happened after. They didn't just fire the guy and put up a sign. Denise sits in that office every week and actually listens. When my upstairs neighbor's kid was crying at 2 in the morning last month, they talked to both of us together instead of just writing me up. That's a small thing maybe, but it's the actual thing, you know? It's not about the plaque. It's about who picks up the phone when something goes wrong, and whether they believe you or assume something about you first. The reporter wrote that quote down word for word, because it was, in its way, the whole story in miniature. Michelle Carter didn't see the article until a week after it ran. Marcus sent it to her with no comment attached, just the link, and she read it standing in her own kitchen, in the new apartment across town she'd moved into after the case closed, near enough to her mother's facility, but far enough from Aldridge Court that she could genuinely call it a fresh start. She'd recused herself from every matter touching Wexler Property Management, past or future, the day she filed her original complaint, and she'd kept that recusal even after the case resolved, declining even to read the final consent decree until it was already public record, like everyone else's. She read Alicia Torres's quote twice. Whether they believe you or assume something about you first. She thought about writing it down in her notebook out of habit, and then didn't, because some things didn't need to be filed away to be remembered. Instead, she made herself tea and sat by the window and let herself feel, for a few quiet minutes, something she rarely let herself feel about any case. Something close to satisfaction, not because a man had lost his business, but because a stranger she'd never meet had a place to go now when something went wrong, and that place hadn't existed 8 months earlier. It wasn't everything. She knew better than most people how far better still was from fixed. But it was real, and it was something she'd helped build without ever raising her voice to do it, and for one evening, she let that be enough. The hearing room at the Ohio State House Annex was nothing like the one at Aldridge Court's fate had been decided in, bigger, brighter, cameras mounted at the back for the public feed. A long dais where members of the House Housing and Community Development Committee sat with name placards and glasses of water they mostly didn't touch. Michelle Carter sat at the witness table, not in her robe. She'd been careful about that distinction from the start, testifying here as a subject matter expert and former administrative judge, not in any official capacity tied to the bench, with a single-page written statement in front of her that she barely needed to look at. "Thank you for the opportunity to testify," she began. "I want to be direct about my connection to this bill, because I think transparency matters more than most procedural courtesies. 8 months ago, I was the subject of an illegal eviction attempt by a landlord who fabricated 2 noise complaints against me in retaliation for what he perceived incorrectly as my not fitting the character he wanted his building to project. I only avoided the outcome that landlord intended because I had professional training and institutional standing that let me contest it effectively and quickly. Most tenants don't have that. That gap is what House Bill 214 is designed to close." She walked the committee through the mechanics plainly, without embellishment. The bill, drafted with input from the Civil Rights Commission and modeled directly on the pattern uncovered in the Wexler investigation, would require any landlord found liable for a discrimination-based violation to submit every eviction notice for 3 years afterward to independent third-party review before it could take effect. A neutral compliance officer, paid by a small statewide fund rather than by the landlord, checking the timeline, the paper trail, and the stated cause before a single tenant could be forced out. "This isn't a punishment clause tacked onto the back of a settlement," Michelle said, when a committee member asked why the review requirement mattered beyond the civil penalties already available. "Civil penalties are backward-looking. They tell a landlord what it costs after the fact. This is forward-looking. It assumes correctly that a landlord who has already been found to discriminate once is statistically more likely to try again in a smaller, quieter way, a delayed maintenance request, a selectively enforced noise policy, precisely because those are harder to prove than the first time around. Independent review at the point of the notice, rather than after the eviction is already filed in court, is the difference between catching this early and catching it years later after real damage has already been done to a family. Representative Dana Chu, the committee chair, leaned into her microphone. Judge Carter, and I understand you're not testifying today in that capacity, but I think everyone in this room knows who you are. Can you speak to how this might have changed your own situation, had it existed at the time? Michelle considered the question carefully, the way she considered most things. Honestly, I'm not sure it would have changed much for me personally, she said. I had resources most tenants don't. What it would have changed is the 4 other tenants who came forward once my case became public, people who had no idea their own evictions, months or years earlier, fit a pattern, because nobody outside the building was ever positioned to notice. A review requirement means somebody with no financial stake in the outcome is looking at the paperwork before the tenant is already packing boxes. That's the entire difference this bill is trying to make. The bill passed committee 3 weeks later, 7-2, and moved to the full House floor. Marcus texted her a photo of the vote tally the moment it posted. No caption necessary. Denise Holloway watched the vote from her phone, sitting in the tenant resource office at Aldrich Court on a slow Tuesday afternoon between appointments, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel about any of it, a strange, quiet pride, not in herself exactly, but in the fact that the worst thing she'd ever been part of had ended up, eventually, somewhere useful. Michelle didn't attend the floor vote. She'd said what she needed to say in committee, and had no interest in becoming the face of a bill that belonged in the end to every tenant who'd never had a folder full of hotel receipts and calendar entries to fall back on. She spent that afternoon instead the way she spent most of her Tuesdays now, at her mother's care facility, sitting by the window, reading aloud from a book her mother could no longer quite follow, but still seemed to enjoy the sound of. Her phone buzzed once with the news. She glanced at it, smiled slightly, and put it away, and kept reading. A year and a half after Michelle Carter signed a lease under her own name in a building she thought would just be an ordinary place to live, a tenant named Farah Osei stood in a hearing room in Cleveland, 200 miles from Columbus, holding a folder of her own. She'd never met Michelle, never would, but her attorney had cited something called the Wexler Standard twice in the brief sitting on the judge's desk, the pattern or practice framework that had emerged from the commission's findings, now referenced in training materials for housing attorneys across the state, now shaping how investigators looked for patterns instead of waiting for them to announce themselves. Farah's landlord had tried the same quiet trick Gary Wexler had tried, a fabricated complaint, a selectively enforced clause. And this time, because of a law that hadn't existed 2 years earlier, an independent reviewer had caught the inconsistency before the eviction notice ever reached her door. She never found out the review requirement existed because of a judge she'd never heard of, in a building she'd never lived in a city 2 hours away. She just knew that the notice she'd been dreading never came, and the landlord's story fell apart in front of a reviewer who had no reason to protect him. That was, in its way, exactly how it was supposed to work. Not with anyone remembering the name behind it. Just with fewer people ending up packing boxes for reasons that were never really about the boxes at all. Michelle heard about the Cleveland case secondhand from Marcus over coffee on a Sunday morning months later. One small item in a longer conversation about the review board's first-year numbers, 41 flagged notices statewide, 19 of them withdrawn once a landlord realized someone neutral was actually going to look. 41, Marcus said, sliding his phone across the table so she could see the report. First year. You want to guess how many of those would have just gone through quietly before the bill? All of them, Michelle said. All of them, Marcus agreed. She didn't ask for the details on the Cleveland case or any of the others. She didn't need her name attached to know the shape of what had changed. She thought sometimes about Gary Wexler, not with anger anymore, mostly with a kind of tired clarity, the way you think about whether that's already passed through. She'd heard distantly, that he'd taken a job managing warehouse inventory somewhere outside the city, work that didn't involve deciding who got to live where. She hoped, in the uncomplicated way she'd told him on the courthouse steps, that he'd actually used the time to understand it. She didn't know if he had. That wasn't hers to track anymore. She thought more often about Alicia Torres's line from the newspaper article, whether they believe you or assume something about you first, and about the quiet fact that an office with Denise Holloway's name on the schedule now existed in a building where 18 months earlier, nothing like it had been thought necessary. That evening, back in her own apartment, Michelle sat by the window with her tea, the same ritual she'd built for herself since the case closed, and watched the last of the light go gold and then gray over the rooftops of a city that had, in its slow and imperfect way, gotten a little bit harder to discriminate quietly in. She never raised her voice through any of it. She hadn't needed to. You don't always get to choose the moment you're tested, she said once to no one, just turning the thought over the way she turned over everything. You only get to choose what you do with it once it finds you. Conclusion. There's a version of this story where Michelle Carter never says a word, where she reads the eviction notice, decides it isn't worth the fight, quietly finds a new apartment, and moves on with her life the way so many tenants before her had no choice but to do. Nobody would have blamed her for it. She had every reason, professionally and personally, to want this to disappear quietly. She chose the harder version instead, not because she wanted to fight, but because she understood something most people never get the chance to learn firsthand, that the difference between an isolated bad landlord and a pattern of discrimination is usually just a matter of who's counting and who's believed when they say something is wrong. What makes this story matter isn't the reveal in the hearing room, dramatic as that moment was. It's everything that happened after it. A leasing agent who'd stayed quiet out of fear, finding the courage to hand over the truth. A business partner choosing to rebuild rather than deny. A tenant resource office that didn't exist before, staffed by someone who understood exactly why it needed to. A law, now on the books in Ohio, catching 41 fabricated notices in its first year alone. 19 of them withdrawn the moment someone neutral actually looked closely. A tenant in Cleveland who never even knew Michelle's name, sleeping in her own bed instead of packing boxes, because a system built out of one woman's ordinary lease had quietly done its job 200 miles away. Gary Wexler wasn't a monster in the way stories sometimes need their villains to be. That's the uncomfortable part worth sitting with. He was a man who told himself a comfortable story about character and standards for 20 years, and never once had to test whether that story was true, because no one with the power to make him answer for it had ever lived in his building before. That's not an excuse. It's the actual mechanism, the quiet, unexamined kind of bias that doesn't announce itself, that hides behind words like policy and standard practice, until someone forces it into the light. Michelle never raised her voice. She never needed to. Her power was never really about the robe or the title or the badge she happened to carry into that hearing room. It was in the small, deliberate habit of writing things down, of asking one more question than she was expected to ask, of refusing to let a story end simply because the person telling it was used to being believed without being questioned. That's the part of this story that belongs to everyone watching, whether you'll ever sit on a bench or not. You don't need a title to notice a pattern. You don't need power to write down what actually happened. Sometimes that's the whole difference between a story that ends quietly in someone else's favor and one that ends in yours. Thank you so much for watching this one all the way through. It means more than you know. If this story hit for you, drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because I've got 2 more hand-picked stories lined up that I think you're going to love just as much as this one. See you in the next one.